In the last episode, I told you about the disruption. Federal grants pulled at scale, a lexical filter on the language of science, an institutional layer that's gone quiet. This episode is about the response, what the leaders I interviewed are actually doing. And here's the thing that surprised me. They're not improvising. There is a leadership pattern that shows up across all 6 interviews, word for word in some cases, and it maps almost perfectly to what the academic literature on adaptive crisis leadership has been saying for the last 20 years. They are not winging it. They are executing, and they don't even know they're executing a playbook that's already in the journals. This is the Resilience Playbook. Episode 2, The Response. Let's start with money, because no leadership behavior matters if your team can't get paid. The leaders I interviewed are not waiting for federal funding to come back. They are actively assembling research budgets from heterogeneous sources, industry contracts, private philanthropy, institutional bridge funds, and this is the new one state level proposals. There's a movement in California right now to create a California NIH funded by a state bond measure. I interviewed the vice chair who's helping organize that effort. They held a rally on May 4th, 2026. It's real. The research director told me this directly. Quote, "We had more industry funding than federal. We tried to redirect where we could. The School of Medicine did roll out some funding for folks that did lose their grants to act as a bridge." End quote. Bridge funding is a term of art. It's not a new invention. The American Society of Hematology started a bridge grant program back in 2013 after the federal sequestration. Akowitz and Hromas wrote it up in Blood Advances in 2018. ASH grantees who got bridge support went on to receive on average about a 7-fold return in subsequent NIH funding. The architecture for surviving federal funding instability already exists. We just have to use it. The leaders who do this proactively, who manage their funding portfolio the way a financial advisor manages an investment portfolio, they shorten the disruption window for their bench teams. They keep coordinators employed. They keep postdocs from leaving. The leaders who treat funding diversification as an emergency improv lose people. There's a complication here that I want to name because it cuts both ways. The Lancet paper I cited in episode 1, Cavalcanti and colleagues, modeled what happens at the global health scale when federal funding is removed. Industry and philanthropy cannot replace federal capacity at that scale. 14 million additional deaths by 2030. Patchwork funding works at the department and division level. It does not work as a substitute for federal infrastructure. It buys time. It does not solve the underlying problem. And one more interview moment that I want listeners to sit with. The same program director told me that, quote, "The competition to work with industry has been furious. We usually have a very strong site, especially when it comes to reproductive endocrinology, just because we see so many patients. And there were at least 2 instances in the last year where we lost contracts to lower priced sites." End quote. Industry funding is not a passive substitute. It is a competitive market, and the market just got more competitive. This is the longest section of the episode because this is the center of the leadership pattern. Listen to this quote from the research director. Quote, "I've made an effort to tell them, consistently, if you see something on the news, don't be afraid. Let me worry about it." End quote. She runs a 6-person team. Her division had a major federal grant pulled midstream. And what she said to her team every week in their Wednesday meeting was, "Don't worry about it. I'll worry about it." Now, your first instinct, if you're a manager, is going to be, "That's bad." That's information asymmetry. That's a leader hiding the truth from her team. But I read it across all 6 interviews. The vice chair said something almost identical. The division chief said something almost identical. The principal investigator in surgical oncology said something almost identical. Here's what they're actually doing. They're absorbing the cognitive labor of uncertainty so the bench scientists can keep doing science. They are not hiding information. They are filtering it. They tell their teams what is actionable. They do not tell them every 7 a.m. tweet from Washington, every rumor about an executive order, every back channel report from a program officer. That filtering is leadership work that does not show up on any org chart. And the leaders are doing it on top of their actual jobs. Sott and Bender published a systematic review in the journal Human Resources in 2024. They synthesized adaptive leadership in crisis literature across healthcare, public sector, and military settings. They found 4 consistent levers: cognitive flexibility, strategic empathy, distributed decision making, and relational trust. The "let me do the worrying" contract is strategic empathy paired with distributed decision making. The leader holds the cognitive labor. The team executes the work. Hybrid hierarchical collaborative response patterns outperform either pure hierarchy or pure collaboration in crisis. This isn't an isolated finding. McKim and colleagues, in a 2022 AMEE guide for health professions educators, applied Ronald Heifetz's adaptive leadership framework to medical education contexts. Heifetz makes a distinction that sits at the heart of all of this. Some challenges are technical. They have known solutions. You apply expertise. Other challenges are adaptive. No known solution exists. The work is to develop new capacities in real time while under pressure. The 2026 federal policy environment is a textbook adaptive challenge. Heinish's strategies: get on the balcony to see the whole system, then translate into action, describe exactly what the leaders I interviewed are doing. There's a sharper version of this same pattern from another leader in the study. A lab director told me, quote, "I insulate my people from Alibit. My job is to bring the money in and help them navigate. I don't feel it's appropriate for me to take my stress and lay it on their shoulders. They've got enough things, and I don't want them worrying about every little thing," end quote. Same contract, different words, same architecture. And here is where I have to introduce a hard limit on this pattern, because the same director taught me something else. Last year, in 2024, the Trump administration announced they were freezing all federal grants. Federal grants pay her people, most of her lab. The freeze was announced on a Tuesday. End of the month was the following Tuesday. She was looking at the math, calculating which of her people lived paycheck to paycheck, and trying to figure out which of her own funds she could deploy to cover them. Her quote was, quote, "I just couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't sleep, I was stressed. I disengaged," end quote. Shielding works, and it has a personal cost. The leaders absorbing federal scale uncertainty so their teams can do science are paying for it with their health. Any institution relying on this pattern as a long-term solution will eventually lose their leaders. Now I want to introduce a complication, because if you take everything I just said at face value, you might walk away with the wrong lesson. Van Rokel and colleagues published a natural experiment paper in Public Management Review in 2025. Empowering leadership, giving people autonomy and trust, can be less effective during crisis. Autonomy without adequate scaffolding intensifies follower stress. The let me do the worrying contract works because it's shielding paired with predictable, more frequent communication, not less. The leaders in my interviews moved their cross-departmental meetings from quarterly to monthly. They scheduled in-person convenings. They created standing weekly check-ins. The shielding only works because the scaffolding is also there. If you take the shielding without the scaffolding, you get information asymmetry that intensifies anxiety. Don't do that. The third piece of the response is the most subtle. It is about how leaders preserve inclusive practice in their teams when the labels for inclusion have been stripped from the funding. Diversity supplements at NIH, gone. Race-based provisions in scholar selection, gone. Programs explicitly named underrepresented in science, restructured. So how do leaders maintain the practice of inclusion when the institutional scaffolding for it is being dismantled? The vice chair told me this, quote, "If you truly believe that having different perspectives isn't going to enrich the environment, we're still selecting scholars, we're still doing programs and thinking about what do they bring to the table? What's their perspective? Making sure that we don't just have one type and one voice and one contribution coming into a whole program." End quote. The labels are gone. The values aren't. She's framing inclusion as a quality criterion, as scientific rigor, not as a compliance category. The primary investigator I interviewed put it differently. Quote, "I just picked the best people, and they turned out to be ethnically diverse. I didn't have to even think about that issue because it just naturally happened." End quote. He's describing inclusion as a downstream effect of getting the hiring process right, selecting for capability, then noticing that capability is broadly distributed. That's a different framing than "we need to meet a target," and it survives in environments where the targets have been removed. The program director at a different institution told me she buys Pride t-shirts every June out of her budget. Quote, "You can celebrate it without having to be funded or being in the public eye and still get your employees aware about what you're going to be doing." End quote. Micro rituals, symbolic framework in Ballman and Bowman and deal terms. The symbolic frame is where meaning lives. When the structural frame mechanisms for inclusion get stripped, leaders move the work into the symbolic frame. Quiet, local, self-funded. There's foundational research that grounds this. Nembard and Edmondson, in the Journal of Organizational Behavior in 2006, defined leader inclusiveness, words and deeds that invite and appreciate others' contributions. They showed empirically that leader inclusiveness generates psychological safety, and that psychological safety mediates engagement in quality improvement work. This is the load-bearing point. Inclusion as a leadership behavior, separate from inclusion as a labeled program, measurably improves how teams perform, especially cross-disciplinary teams with status differences, which is exactly what a research lab is. The vice chair I quoted earlier is, in Nembard and Edmondson's terms, practicing leader inclusiveness without the labels. The function is preserved even when the program is dismantled. Here is the complication, and I want to be honest about it. The Liu and colleagues paper from episode 1, The one documenting that NIH grant terminations fell disproportionately on minority researchers and women's health work. That finding does not go away because individual leaders practice inclusive ethos in their teams. Leader level inclusion is necessary. The structural mechanisms that operated at the funder level, diversity supplements, underrepresented scholar pathways, those did real work that no leader can fully substitute for. We should be clear eyed about that. So that is the response. Patchwork funding run as portfolio strategy. Shielding paired with scaffolding, the let me do the worrying contract, with weekly meetings to back it up. And inclusion preserved through ethos when labels are stripped. None of this is improvisation. All of it is documented, researched, and replicable. The leaders I interviewed are doing department-level adaptive leadership work that is filling a gap their institutions cannot publicly fill. That's the move. That's what holding the line looks like. In the next episode, The Stakes, we go to the part that keeps these leaders up at night. Not their grants, their juniors. The pipeline. We talk about why a 2025 Nature poll found that 75% of US scientists are considering leaving the country. Why postdocs are taking industry jobs 6 months early. Why France and the Netherlands are actively recruiting American researchers. And why the leaders I interviewed are spending their own protected time on their juniors instead of their own grants. That's the rational move, and the literature says so. Until then, thank you for listening. This is the Resilience Playbook.